Hey everybody, welcome back to an all new episode of 10 to Life with me, Annie Elise. I hope you guys are all having a great day so far. I'm about to make you really frustrated and I'm about to kind of dump all over it because we've got another case. Now, if you guys are a returning 10 to Lifer, you get it. You know what it is we do here, you know why we talk about these cases. If you're brand new checking out the channel for the first time, first and foremost, welcome. I hope you appreciate the case coverage. And what we do here is we talk about true crime cases. We try to highlight different ones that are not talked about too often, bring awareness to those, and especially if it has to do with somebody who's missing or some shady circumstances, just to get the word out. Because I feel like once people start talking about it more, maybe sharing tips, things go viral. We've seen the internet work miracles, right? And that's kind of what I'm hoping for with today's case, because it can be really frustrating when you're trying to solve a mystery and it feels like the answer is right in front of your face, except you can't prove it. You want to just say look, that person did it. It's so obvious. How do you not see that? But something can be obvious and still not meet our legal rules around what it takes to arrest somebody or press charges against them. And of course, there's a good reason why we do have those rules. Rules about crime scene investigations, rules about trials. You don't want to go after somebody who's innocent, we know that. And it's good when police officers take their time and try to be careful to make sure that they have their evidence to back their theories up. But that said, when the smoking gun is missing, or when there's a few pieces of the puzzle that maybe just don't fit, it leaves you feeling like maybe you'll never see justice for the victim. And that's what's going on in today's case, which reminds me a lot of Crystal Rogers. That's another story where we know so much, while at the same time we know so little. And I think that by the time we go through today's story from top to bottom, you'll probably agree with me about how frustrating all of this is, because there's so much room to read between the lines and guess at certain details, but there's a real lack of proof about anything. Today's story and today's case is about Dia Abrams. So guys, let's jump right in. Lydia Abrams, who went by Dia, was born on July 6, 1954. She was a California native who grew up in San Diego before eventually settling down 2 hours north in Mountain Center, California. Dia's hometown was nothing like San Diego or Los Angeles, with all of their hustle, the bustle, the busy town, but Dia liked Mountain Center specifically because it was quiet and it was so out of the way. She really liked the slow pace of small town life and also being around animals. She also seemed to embody a lot of the stereotypes that you hear about people from small towns. She was known to be very sweet, known to be very caring. She watched out for her neighbors, checked in on people when they needed it, stuff like that. In 1984, she married a man named Clem Abrams, and they had 2 children together, Chrisara and Clinton. Now, life was pretty good for the Abrams. Clem was a successful developer, and he and Dia both made a killing off of real estate. They owned 3 different luxury properties in Mountain Center alone, and they were very successful. But even though the family was doing well, money, we know it can't buy everything. Not even marital bliss. Over the years, Dia and Clem, they grew apart, and even though they still loved each other a lot, they eventually went through a separation. Clem moved back to the San Diego area, and Dia stayed at the ranch. Before they could either reconcile, though, or get a divorce, Clem passed away in 2018. He was 78 years old. Now, Dia was absolutely crushed by this, and like I said, they were separated, but she still loved him. But at 64 years old, Dia was 14 years younger than her husband, and she still had a lot of life left in her. So she kept moving forward. Dia officially took over the family's 116-acre property, which was worth $4.9 million. It was a ranch, but it also had the house where she had lived for the past 15 years. Then there was the land around it, which Dia just loved, especially because she always had been the outdoorsy type. When she wasn't home, she was hiking in a nearby national park, Plus, Dia raised horses and loved all kinds of animals, so needless to say, the ranch was kind of the perfect place for her. It also makes sense that when Dia felt ready to get back into the dating scene again, she created an account on the website Farmers Only. Now, I'm sure you've seen the ads for this site. It's supposed to be a place where ranchers and farmers can connect, they can find love, and in Dia's mind, it made sense to start looking on Farmers Only, because she'd be able to find people with a similar background, similar interests, and she didn't have to search very long before she connected with a man named Keith Harper in 2014. Keith had grown up on a ranch in Idaho before he moved to Colorado to start his own business in recreational outfitting. Now, I wasn't exactly sure what that meant at first, but basically it's somebody who assists with outdoor tourism and all of the gear and all of the services that go along with it. It'll make a little bit more sense when we talk about a specific story related to Keith later on in the video, but it meant that he and Dia had a lot to talk about and a lot to bond over. For a few months, Keith and Dia chatted online about anything and everything that popped into their minds, and they then decided to meet up in real life. Now, I know in this show I talk a lot about people who hit it off right away, or they feel a spark immediately, but that really was the case for Dia and Keith. She drove her truck to pick him up from the airport, and the first thing that Keith noticed, as soon as he laid his eyes on her, was that she had hay stuck in her hair. See, she had been feeding her horses before she came to get him, and she still had a little bit of hay wrapped up in her hair. And that helped Keith realize that his feelings for her were real. He loved that she was a country girl, through and through, hay and all. And from there, things moved fast. Literally 60 days after that first in-person meeting, Keith sold all of his property in Colorado so that he could go be with Dia. Now, I can't overstate what a big deal this was because he had built his business from the ground up. He also had a grown son who was staying back home. He wasn't moving with Keith. So Keith was giving up literally everything for a woman that he had known for all of 2 months. Now, I know that sometimes it can be a red flag for two people to get too serious too fast, but as far as Keith and Dia were concerned, it seemed like they had something real. They kept dating for a few years, and then one day in June of 2019, Keith planned a date that involved a hike. Again, they were very outdoorsy, so this was the most romantic idea that Keith could think of. And the particular trail they took went by a rock formation that has been nicknamed the Butterfly. And that is where Keith got down on one knee and he asked Dia to marry him. And of course, she said yes. But they were going to have to wait before they could move forward with their wedding plans because we all know what happened just 9 months after the summer of 2019. The whole world shut down, COVID-19. But lucky for Dia and Keith, they had 119 acres full of livestock to help keep them occupied. While everybody else was figuring out how to adapt to virtual school and work from home and toilet paper shortages, they just went about like it was business as usual. They had a pretty regular routine of chores that needed to be done every day as well, so that helped keep them busy. And on Saturday, June 6th, 2020, it began just like any other day for them in lockdown. Dia and Keith took care of business, then they finally sat down together for lunch around 2:30 p.m. They compared notes on what they had already taken care of for the day and what was still left on the to-do list, and a lot of it couldn't be put off any longer because Keith and Dia were actually planning to travel. See, some COVID restrictions had just been lifted, and they wanted to take the opportunity to get back to Colorado for the first time in months. They were hoping to head out the very next day, so it was especially important for them to get everything done. After they finished eating, Dia and Keith got back to work on their separate chores. And Keith was busy enough that he stayed out until around 7:30 p.m. that evening. When he got back, he noticed that the house was pretty dark, and it was also pretty quiet. It looked like Dia hadn't made it home yet, but just to be sure, he went from room to room checking and calling her name. She didn't answer, and that was confusing to Keith. He knew she had a lot to do, but he honestly just figured it would take him longer to wrap up his work than it would take her. Plus, they had an early morning ahead of them, and he knew that Dia wouldn't want to stay out too late. So he tried calling her phone, but she didn't pick up. She also hadn't texted him for a couple of hours. Now that, it wasn't weird on its own, but then Keith noticed that Dia's truck was still in the driveway, and the part of the ranch where she was working was really far away. It was definitely not walking distance. So that meant that Dia wasn't actually still out working. She had driven back home, then left again at some point, and she'd either walked off on foot, taken some other vehicle like an ATV, or she had gotten into a car with somebody else. But none of those situations seemed likely. In fact, Keith double-checked their bedroom, and that's where he found her purse and her cell phone plugged into the charger still. Now this was a red flag city. But Keith still gave Dia the rest of the night to turn up in case maybe there was some sort of logical explanation. But the next morning, when he still hadn't heard from her, he reported her missing. Now, as for what to do next, you'd think that Keith would have called one of Dia's 2 adult children, either to ask if they had heard from her or just to let them know what was going on. Except Keith didn't call either of them. Dia's son Clinton was living in San Diego at the time, so he wasn't even that far away. He'd been enjoying a weekend off from work when one of Dia's neighbors called him and said that it seemed like something weird was going on at the ranch. There were police cars there. That is how Clinton ended up learning that his mother was missing. And this next development, it made my jaw drop when I first came across it, guys. Dia's children, Clinton and Chrisara, had no idea who Keith was. They'd never heard his name in their entire lives. They hadn't heard anything about their mother being engaged or living with him, even though they supposedly had been together for years at this point. So Clinton got some of his closest friends together and they all headed straight to the ranch. They made it there that night and there were a million different things going through Clinton's head by now. But at the top of his list, it had to be questions about the man who came out and greeted him, claiming to be his mom's fiance. Now, during this first meeting, Clinton also thought that Keith was acting really weird. For example, while everyone else was breaking up into search teams and picking different areas to go look over, all Keith could talk about was the fact that he apparently had meetings to go to, and he couldn't be there to help with the search. It all came across as pretty shifty to her son Clinton, but he just chalked it up to nerves. I mean, some people don't know how to handle a crisis, and maybe Keith was one of those people. Either way, Clinton and his friends began their search, but no matter how far and wide they looked, there were no signs of Dia anywhere. They even put Dia's dogs on the case, hoping they'd pick up Dia's scent. But they didn't find anything either. So with no trace of Dia anywhere on the property, law enforcement suggested that maybe Dia left on her own accord. They still weren't involved in the search yet though, but her kids and her close friends, they were adamant. They said without a doubt there was no chance that Dia would ever leave this ranch willingly. It was her pride and joy, and she treated every animal like it was one of her kids. I mean, seriously, one time wildfires were threatening the property and Dia refused to evacuate. She risked her life to save this ranch, and she wasn't going to turn and walk away from it now. But by Monday, her friends and neighbors had been searching for hours, for days, and nobody had found anything. So I think by then they realized that the search for Dia was a little more than they could handle on their own. So that's when they called local authorities. Once Dia had been missing for 36 hours, deputies went to the ranch to conduct an official search. When the authorities arrived on Monday, they brought in the missing persons unit. They also brought in homicide, dive teams, helicopters, and even bloodhounds. This was also when they stopped trying to convince people that Dia had left on her own, and they finally started treating the ranch like a possible crime scene. And you'd think that this would be really upsetting and stressful for her fiancé Keith, right? I mean, he hadn't heard from Dia for a couple of days now, and the police, the professionals who know how to read these situations, they were now acting like she had gotten in serious trouble. It would be hard to keep your hopes up. But Keith mostly came across as okay, better than okay even. You could say he was putting on a brave face, but he was joking with people, and he was goofing around, and he still wasn't helping with the searches. It was just like the night when Clinton first arrived. Keith said he was too busy. And looking for Dia, it just wasn't a priority. Now, obviously, this would be a red flag in any situation, right? Who acts like their job is more important than a loved one who's gone missing? But what makes this even more outrageous to me is that Keith wasn't even supposed to be working that week. Remember, he and Dia originally wanted to leave for a trip to Colorado on Sunday morning. So not only was Keith blowing off searches to go to work, but this was work that we know for a fact was not urgent, because he wasn't even supposed to be around to take care of it anyway. Plus, Keith couldn't even keep his story straight. He told a bunch of different people that he had to get to a really important meeting in Arizona. But when anybody asked what the meeting was about or why it was so important, he gave all sorts of different and contradictory answers. Either way, though, Keith ended up heading out of town for this mysterious meeting, and he stayed away for an entire week. His disappearing act was so suspicious that the police got a warrant to search his RV, also to search a storage business that he owned in New Mexico and one of Dia's properties, a place called Sky High Ranch. So on June 13th, 2020, so a little under a week after Dia's disappearance, they seized multiple items from the RV's front passenger seat. Also, a lot of items from the business. Now, I'm not sure what exactly they took because that information hasn't been released to the public, but I do know that they also found 357 pounds of processed marijuana and 2,300 marijuana plants at Sky High Ranch, which kind of obvious name for a pot farm, but whatever. Now, none of this was found to be connected to Dia's disappearance whatsoever, and it was just a wild coincidence that whoever had been renting Sky High Ranch from her had this side hustle of growing marijuana, and they got caught up in something out of their control. But the detectives did find some alarming and relevant evidence at Dia's house. Right on her front porch, the investigators found two .22 caliber shell casings, and Dia's bedroom door almost looked like it had been kicked in. The trim had been slightly cracked, and it was obvious that somebody had broken it down from the outside, as opposed to somebody in the bedroom trying to break it to get out. They also found small traces of blood on Dia and Keith's bedsheets. So when Keith came back from that week-long business trip to Arizona, the investigator sat down with him and asked him all about it. They started by pressing him to explain why he went away at such a delicate time in the first place. He tried to say that he was out of town handling, quote, tax issues. Keith said if he didn't take care of them, he'd end up with a lien on the property. And these tax issues could apparently only be resolved if he went and paid with cash or a cashier's check, which was why he couldn't just drop a check in the mail or handle it online. Then they asked him about those shell casings on the porch, and he acted like it was the stupidest question. Keith said that the ranch had a lot of trouble with coyotes, and sometimes he fired into the air to scare them off. Now, if he had stopped talking there, that explanation, it might have been convincing. Except then he quickly added, quote, if you're gonna kill somebody, you ain't gonna kill them with a .22. Now, I guess he needed some PR training or something, because I don't even think I need to say that that comment was not a good look. It was almost as bad as Chad Daybell's story, these raccoons or chipmunks or whatever he said in the backyard running wild and I had to shoot them and kill them, when really it was a cover story for Tylee and JJ, if you're familiar with that case. But you should have just stopped talking at that point. Now, as for the blood spots on the sheets, shocker. Keith had an explanation for those as well. He said that he took medications which thinned his blood, and that it also made it easy for him to get little cuts all over. Later on, a reporter asked him about the blood again though, and Keith stuck to his story and said, quote, I bleed all the time. Every week you can come and you'll find blood drops on the sheets. If it had been her blood, do you think that you would have not heard about that? Obviously, it's my blood. So it was kind of just like red flag after red flag with Keith. But he had an explanation for everything. And the police, they couldn't prove for sure that he was lying about the coyotes or the blood or anything else. So next, they took a look at how Dia spent the last few days, weeks, and months before her disappearance. And it turned out that she had spent some time ruffling a few feathers. In fact, she spent years locked in a courtroom fight against her own children. It all came down to how they should split the inheritance from Dia's first husband, Clem. The children, Clinton and Chrisara, were supposed to be the executors of his will, but Dia felt like she wasn't getting her fair share in it. She tried to argue that she should get more than what Clem had left her. However, the kids were pushing back. Now, obviously, taking legal action against your own children isn't going to make for a very loving or supportive home environment. So unfortunately, Dia hadn't gotten along all that well with Clinton or Chrisara before Clem's death either. So the fight over the inheritance just made everything worse. The main thing that Dia wanted was to invalidate her and Clem's 1984 prenup. It stated that both Clem and Dia's income would stay separate in life and after death. Like we mentioned earlier, Clem made an absolute killing off of real estate and was an extremely successful developer. During their 34-year marriage, Dia had never really worked and really didn't have any income. It's not as if she had been left with nothing. I mean, she had properties and her own trust, but nothing near what Clem had. To be specific, she wanted $6.7 million from the estate that her children were now in charge of. And that's a lot of money to fight over, and it clearly made her very bitter. Because also, check this out, Dia's trust had been set up in 2016. And just like Clem's, her children were named the beneficiaries of her trust and her estate. But then in 2018, after Clem passed, a handwritten clause was added to Dia's trust. And I think it says everything that you need to know about the type of relationship she had with her kids by then. Because the clause stated, quote, Trestor leaves nothing but her love and affection to her son Clinton Abrams and daughter Crisara Abrams. Now you're probably wondering, if she took her kids off of her trust, then who did she leave it to? Well, just 2 weeks before Dia disappeared, on May 22nd, 2020, Dia transferred everything to Keith, and also to another woman named Diana Fetter. So this meant that she signed away literally everything to these 2 people, including her trust, estate, power of attorney. I mean, we're talking literally everything. She was still fighting with her kids in court for that $6 million, and she had quite a bit on her own. And Keith and Diana, should Dia have passed before them, they would have stood to gain a lot. So let's talk about that other woman that Dia named in her trust, Diana Fetter. She and Dia first met in 2015. They both lived near Mountain Center. In fact, they were basically neighbors. They became good friends, and Diana even looked up to Dia a bit, like she was a big sister figure of sorts. Diana was also one of the last people who ever talked to Dia before her disappearance. See, the morning that she disappeared, they were texting about a pressure washer. So to summarize, it's pretty obvious that Dia didn't get along with her kids, and she was kind of creating a sort of newfound family with people like Keith and Diana. But her son Clinton said that as bad as their relationship had gotten, she still would have told him that she was engaged. So the fact that she never brought it up had him thinking that there was something else going on here. He also saw his mother as somebody who was very careful about her finances and also her business. He felt like she was way too savvy to be so careless about her finances with some man that she had met on the internet. Now, of course, we could argue that just because Dia met Keith on the internet, that doesn't mean that she didn't know him personally or close enough to trust him with her finances. Most people meet on the internet nowadays anyway, so I'm not quite sure what Clinton was so in denial about. I mean, if Keith is to be believed, he and Dia had been in a serious relationship for years and they were engaged, so it makes sense that she would share those things with him. Keith himself has said in interviews that he, quote, didn't get involved in Dia's finances, but he got moved onto her trust, so I mean, he clearly was involved enough. The topic of their engagement is pretty interesting in and of itself, though. It turns out not a single person knew that Keith and Dia were engaged. So when Keith started doing all of these interviews talking about their engagement and the wedding that they were planning for that summer, nobody really believed it. Both of Dia's kids, as well as her sister Peggy, all said that they had never even heard of an engagement, and they all claimed that Dia would never remarry after Clem. Now, just to play devil's advocate for a minute, I could see a Dia getting engaged and keeping the news from her kids and even her sister. Apparently, Dia and Peggy hadn't even spoken since 2005, so it had been a good 15 years.
I look at him and I think there's no way that she met some guy on a, what was it, farmers or ranchers or whatever. That's not my sister. I mean, maybe she went on a dating site. Maybe she did. But she would, first of all, she never would have remarried. She never would have remarried this dude, ever, ever. I know my sister. My sister was a class act. He manipulated her. He had her under his thumb. And then when he says in one interview that they were engaged and he didn't know where he bought her wedding ring or her engagement ring. Come the hell on. This is not, no. The whole thing is bullshit. The whole thing is, to me.
I personally wouldn't reach out to a family member I hadn't talked to in 15 years just to tell them that. So as much as it seemed like her family was in denial about the whole thing, Dia's best friend of many years, a woman named Julie Sanford, also hadn't heard anything about an upcoming wedding. Now, that's what makes this engagement story so odd. And remember Keith supposedly proposed in the summer of 2019, a year before Dia went missing? So it's not like this was fresh and Dia hadn't gotten around to mentioning it. It just wasn't adding up. Her best friend, Julie, did say that when she first met Keith, she thought that he really wasn't Dia's type. But they seemed to get along, and Keith was a huge help around the ranch, so Julie didn't really have any complaints about him. She did remember having a conversation with Dia once where Dia said that after Clem's death, she'd never get married again, which again made it sound a lot like this alleged engagement might not have actually happened. Plus, no one ever saw Dia wear a ring, and this was especially weird because when Keith talked about his proposal, he made it sound like the ring was something of a point of contention between them. To hear Keith tell it, Dia didn't even want a ring at first. but he thought that she needed one to make the engagement official. He said he actually convinced her to let him buy her one. Now, of course, he couldn't remember where he bought this alleged engagement ring, which no one had ever seen and nobody knew where it was. He also didn't have a receipt. And we're talking about a purchase that would have probably set him back a few $1,000s, but he couldn't even show anybody a credit card statement or anything to prove that it even existed.
What can you tell me about Keith Harper being her fiancé?
It's definitely not the case. I know my mother. She was not going to remarry.
Keith Harper was not her fiancé?
I don't believe that to be the case.
Do you believe he was her boyfriend?
I do not believe that to be the case either. I believe at one time they were potentially close. I can't say for sure, I do not know. However, I do not believe at the time she had disappeared that they had that type of relationship.
Okay. Had your mom ever said anything to you about breaking it off with Keith Harper or not enjoying his company anymore or anything like that? Was there any advance warning that this was coming?
I had absolutely no clue that he even existed until after she disappeared. So I can't speak to any of that, frankly.
Dia's family and friends also said that Dia was too classy of a person to associate with somebody like Keith. In an interview, Clinton even called Keith a vagabond criminal guy. Because yeah, Keith had a criminal history. Way back in 2000, Keith was married, but his wife accused him of sexual assault. He pled guilty to the charges, but his sentence was just probation. Then he faced new sexual assault allegations in 2011, this time from two young women who said he groped them while he was running a snowmobile tour. Keith argued that the whole thing was just a misunderstanding and that he did nothing wrong. But I don't know, guys, how do you misunderstand getting groped? So far as excuses and cover stories go, this wasn't even good. In an interview with the Dateline Missing in America podcast, Keith explained the situation like this. Quote, I get on the back of her machine. She floors it. Actually goes full throttle on the machine. You probably have 1/10 of a second to make a decision what to do. You're in a wooded area. If that machine continues at that rate, there will be, without a question, an incident and an injury. So I come around her and actually hit the kill switch. You're talking exactly about 3 to 4 seconds. So in other words, because the snowmobile was going too fast, Keith says his only option was to reach around the woman and hit the kill switch, which then resulted in this unlawful touching, the groping. But it didn't sound like the judge was too convinced, because this time, Keith was found guilty on 2 counts of unlawful sexual contact. He spent 1 year in jail and he had to go on the registry for the next 10 years. Now, one person who did believe Keith's side of the story was Dia. Apparently, Dia told her best friend Julie that she knew all about Keith's past and she wanted to be with him anyway. They were focused on building a life together. But according to Keith, it wasn't all sunshine and roses from there. See, apparently Dia made some comments to him from time to time about how she feared for her life. She also told Keith that she might someday have to leave the ranch for her own safety, and that might explain why she went missing. She may have run away from whoever she was scared of. Now, of course, that assumes you believe anything that Keith said. And he couldn't come up with any evidence to show that Dia was really scared or thinking about disappearing. No texts, no anything. He also didn't know who she was afraid of or why this mysterious person or people wanted to hurt her. And you'd think that if the person you were in love with was this afraid, you'd ask them what was going on, right? But to hear Keith tell it, he never bothered to follow up on these stories. He was just like, okay, guess somebody's trying to murder you, let's move on. It was just casual and passing. He didn't think much of what she said at all until June 6th, 2020, the day that she went missing. That morning, her Ring camera caught her bringing some cinnamon rolls to one of her neighbors. I guess they told Dia that they had a craving, and she decided to do the nice neighborly thing and bring over a little treat for them. Now, this might not sound like a huge deal, but it does establish that Dia was still alive at around 9 a.m., which was when she was caught filmed on this Ring camera. So after that point, there's no real record of where Dia went or what she did. All we have to go by is Keith's testimony, and by now I think it's safe to say that nobody was super willing to take him at his word. He said they had lunch together at around 2:30, then they went their separate ways. Now apparently later on that day, Dia called him and asked if he had a minute because she needed to talk to him. This was according to Keith. He said he couldn't because he was busy mowing the meadow, and he said that they would chat once they both got back to the house. Now, when he was talking about this conversation later with the police, he made a huge deal about the fact that he was mowing the meadow. I guess he really wanted to make it clear that the meadow was his alibi. Except a neighbor later told some reporters that there was no way that that meadow was freshly cut. This neighbor actually walked through it a few days after Dia disappeared. Even though it was June and the grass could grow pretty quickly, he said that there were weeds all the way up to his knees, and also that foxtails got stuck to his pants and his socks. Either way, though, Keith still insisted that he was working in the meadow and that he didn't head home until 7 p.m., and that when he got back, Dia was gone. But then he double-checked his phone to see if he missed any calls or texts from her, and he saw one from 4:20 p.m., and it read, "You cannot save me from all things. Even if you believe you can, you cannot." Creepy, right? But nothing came of that. And actually, after everything we just talked about, nothing came from the suspicions about Keith either. It's about to become a theme here. Every search party, dive team, cadaver dogs, all came up the same. Empty. Similar to the Crystal Rogers case, it was like she just disappeared into thin air. Every lead came up empty. The searches on her property were completed and called off, and the community had no helpful tips or answers to come forward with. And Dia's case became frustratingly quiet. And due to the pandemic, it couldn't even hold on to the headlines for very long. There were no new developments at all until 2 days before Christmas in 2021. That day, Keith called 911 and reported that a horse handler who worked at the ranch named Jody Newkirk had been in an ATV accident. Apparently, the last time that he talked to Jody, she said that she was going to go get a Christmas tree. 30 minutes later, he went to check on her, and he found her pinned underneath the ATV. Keith figured that she must have slid on the ice or turned the wheel wrong or something. When the first responders arrived, they found Jody lying under the ATV just like Keith said. They couldn't help her, and she was pronounced dead at the scene at just 46 years old. The odd thing, though, was that the police looked over her body, and they identified what they called unexplained injuries. They then called in the homicide team right away to investigate further. Then a few days later, police officers gave a press conference where they said that the death was suspicious. Even without his possible connection to Dia's disappearance, this looked pretty bad for Keith now, especially since the day before Jody passed, she spoke to her sister on the phone and she said that she and Keith were having an argument. It turns out Keith had pawned her horse without even asking her permission, and he was planning on keeping the money all to himself. So I think it should go without saying that Jody was pretty upset by this. But apparently Keith felt entitled to Jody's property because their relationship wasn't just a typical employer-employee one, at least not according to some of Jody's diary entries. She addressed one to Keith and she wrote, quote, "I feel like we have gotten kind of on different pages lately. With you gone though, I do miss you, but I'm thinking things are going to be different when you're back. Not sure who will initiate it, but I'm feeling it big time." Then, in another entry, she said that she was jealous because Keith was dating and sleeping with other women. Now, Keith denied all of this. He said he hadn't been on a date in years and basically had no idea what she was even talking about. And in an entry dated September 22nd, 2021, just months before her untimely death, Jody wrote to Dia, as if she were still alive somewhere. And here's what part of Jody wrote, and when she says Harper, she means Keith Harper. Quote, "So even though we never met, I really feel a bond with you. I know it's very possible you may not feel the same. You may just hate my guts. But I hope from the bottom and all of my heart that you realize that I truly have you and yours, all of your animals, friends, and home and possessions, and even Harper's best interest at heart." So, to recap, to me it sounds like Jody and Keith were fighting, Jody was jealous of Keith, and she wanted to take care of Dia's ranch. At least it sounds like Jody had feelings for Keith, and it's possible that they might have been dating or sexually involved, but there were a bunch of journal entries and letters along these lines, guys. It kind of also even implies a little bit like maybe something was going on with them before Dia disappeared. Maybe Dia found out. Jody's family argued that the writing addressed to Keith proved Jody had a secret relationship with him. Or, again, at the very minimum, it showed that she was feeling jealous of him being with other people, him maybe sleeping around. Keith denies it, though. And the journal entries don't really spell it all out. So without Jody here to expand on her side of the story, it's hard to exactly know what went down. Maybe they were just two people working at the ranch with no workplace boundaries. I don't know. It's hard to be sure. Either way, though, Jody's family told Keith that he wasn't welcome at the funeral, but he showed up anyway. Worst of all, he didn't leave until several members of her family, including Jody's daughter, told him that he needed to go. As for the police investigation, unfortunately, Jody's death would turn out to be another unsolved mystery. Her autopsy report came back and it showed that she didn't die in an ATV crash, but she died from a meth overdose. She did have a history of substance abuse, but Jody's family all said that she was sober at the time of her death. Her sister also said that Jody had never overdosed before, and she had a hard time believing that she did that day. But the biggest question was, if Jody died of an overdose, how did her body end up under an ATV? The truth is, we'll never know, because Jody isn't around to explain what happened, and there wasn't enough evidence to prove anything for sure. So that means we basically just have to take Keith's word on a lot of things, as much as we maybe don't want to. This coming Christmas, it's going to be the 3rd anniversary of Jody's death. And so far, nobody has been arrested, even though her family thinks it's pretty weird that 2 different women have died or gone missing under Keith's watch. Like Jody, Dia's case has also pretty much gone cold. So naturally, her loved ones have spent the last 4 years speculating and pointing fingers. In particular, Keith and Clinton have taken turns accusing each other of doing something to Dia. Now, I've spent some time already talking about how suspicious Keith looked from day one. But according to Keith, her son Clinton actually threatened Dia multiple times. Keith also claims to this day that there is more than enough evidence to prove that Clinton was involved, even though he's never actually presented the media or the detectives with any of this so-called evidence that he has. So, just like so many other things, it's his word and his word alone that we're supposed to just trust and we're supposed to just believe. He even went as far as saying that Clinton had attempted to kill Dia once before and almost succeeded.
She had some real complications while she came out of surgery. When she was recovering, the only person in the room was Clinton, and she believed that she was slipped a drug by Clinton that was intended to take her life. And she went into a severe coma for 3 or 4 days before she actually came out. No one brought her. She had to have a neighbor bring her and a neighbor take her back home.
She told you this information about the drug being slipped?
Yes.
Did she report that to any authorities?
She reported it to the doctor, and she had been in a coma for 3 to 4 days. And whatever test he said that would be administered, it would be probably out of her system by then. But she went immediately into a coma.
Do you know if she ever reported that to any law enforcement?
I don't know.
What neighbor are you talking about that brought her there?
I don't. She just said that she had to call a neighbor to take her to the hospital, that her own children were not available to help her. And when it came time to release her, and it may have been Julia, but I don't remember for sure. I think picked her up and brought her home.
So do you know who took Dia in for the back surgery?
I do not.
If Clinton were to say that he took her in for the back surgery, you would dispute that?
She told me that none of her children were available to take her in for back surgery. She had to have a neighbor take her, and only Clinton was in the recovery room. That's the only time she saw any family member.
Finally, Keith noted that even though Clinton had a pretty good alibi since he was in San Diego the day of the disappearance, he could have hired somebody to hurt his mom. Now, it's hard to establish a motive because we know that Dia changed her trust and her kids weren't going to inherit anything. Keith actually said that that might be why Clinton killed her. He was angry. He wanted revenge. But Clinton, of course, said that that was complete bull, and he had no reason to want to hurt his mom, Dia.
Can you see people's opinion that both Keith Harper and yourself could both benefit financially from her disappearance?
No, because I never expected to directly receive anything from my mother, to be honest. I mean,
Well, I mean, she was challenging the prenup and the estate that you and your sister are managing now, and now she's gone, so she can't challenge that.
I wouldn't call it I wouldn't call it any sort of motivation, because we were already winning all of that, to be honest, and none of it was personal. We all loved each other. We've said that on the phone multiple times. We basically had won that battle already. There was no, and I know my mother for my whole life, for 31 years. Nothing surprises me, and I don't take any of it personally. I know her, and we would say all the time how much we loved each other, and I loved her extremely dearly. I loved her so deeply and tenderly, it didn't even take words. And so, even if she won or we won, none of that was consequential. It's just money going back and forth. You know, it's happening all the time. Wire money into her account, and you know, we were taking care of her. I took care of her. I supported her for quite some time, and I was happy to do so. And I would tell her all the time, you know, it's all good. We'll take care of you.
For his part, Keith did everything he could to imply that Clinton wanted to hurt Dia, and that Dia was aware that he was dangerous before she disappeared. Even when he wasn't trying to make Clinton look suspicious, Keith also did what he could do in general to make it seem like Dia had a lot of reason to fear for her life.
You were going to marry her, right?
Correct.
Was that why she was putting properties in trust?
No. She was changing them because she felt that there was a threat to her life.
Okay. All right. But previously, these properties were held between her and her husband, right? And when her husband passed, she had sole ownership of these properties. What was the concern about leaving these properties in sole ownership?
You'd have to ask her. I don't know. I didn't get into her financial affairs.
Okay.
So Keith has always insisted that he had nothing to do with Dia's disappearance. But whenever he talked about it, to reporters in particular, he sort of reminded me of the way that Brooks Houck acted during the Crystal Rogers case. They're both almost a little too confident. They act like they know what the police are thinking and that they're so sure that they're going to be cleared. And obviously that didn't work out for Brooks, and we'll have to wait and see how things play out with Keith as well.
Do you think the cops think you're a suspect?
Oh, I'm sure. I'm a former law enforcement. You always will trace whoever is the last to see her. Yeah, no question.
Have they served search warrants on your cell phone, on your house here?
Oh yeah, we've had our cell phones, our computers, they were all taken.
They showed up here with a search warrant and raided the house?
They didn't raid the house. They have the right to search when there is some question, but they searched the main house without a question.
What former law enforcement are you?
I was with the state of Utah Corrections.
Prison official, or what was your actual
No,
title?
I was over intensive supervision and parole.
You a parole officer?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
And then later, drug enforcement.
Wow, okay. Did you have anything to do with your wife's disappearance?
Absolutely not.
How can you prove that?
I can prove that because I loved the woman. We were going to get married. There was everything positive about our relationship. We didn't have almost any difficulties whatsoever.
Okay.
I have no reason to bring harm to her. I loved that woman.
I'll also note that some people in Reddit and Facebook groups have suggested that Diana and Keith had a secret relationship, and that they planned Dia's disappearance and murder together. None of it is backed up anywhere, and remember, Diana was Dia's best friend, and the person who was supposed to split her estate with Keith if anything happened to Dia. Clinton and Crisara eventually took Keith to court to try to have him removed as a trustee, and it was partly because Keith had originally talked about how he wanted to make the ranch a wildlife reserve in memory of Dia. But instead, he and Diana rented out a few cabins on the property using Airbnb. Clinton and Crisara reached out to Airbnb directly to see if they could take the listings down, and Airbnb agreed to the request, especially when the two children complained that the cabins were, quote, being rented out by a murderer. Even after that, Keith listed the property online as a wedding venue, and court documents showed that he was actively planning to pour cement on parts of the property to create an RV park as well. So Clinton and Cressara argued that Keith was benefiting from Dia's suspicious disappearance. The legal battle dragged on for 3 years, and Clinton and Cressara asked for $300,000, which they planned to use as a reward if anybody could share a tip about Dia's body or help find her potential killer. Instead, they settled with Keith. The deal was that they'd split Dia's estate 50-50, assuming that she was declared dead by 2025. In November of 2023, Keith listed the ranch for sale, which was a total violation of the settlement agreement, though. And honestly, it was a pretty stupid move on his part because he was set to get plenty of money if he just waited another year or so. Instead, as a punishment, a judge removed him as the trustee of Dia's estate, so his impatience cost him everything. To me, this whole incident just proves that Keith is one of those people who thinks that the rules don't apply to him. In fact, his bull just kind of continued after this. See, somewhere along the way, Diana stepped away from the whole situation. There was just too much drama for her. So Diana wasn't managing the estate, and Keith couldn't after the judge ruled against him. So the court put an impartial third party in charge. And this court-appointed trustee heard rumors that Keith had stolen some of Dia's old possessions and then sold them, including an army jeep, exercise and gym equipment, and a red ATV. The reports were credible enough that the trustee kicked Keith off the property entirely. Keith had until January 28, 2024 to pretty much pack up his crap and go. And that's the last that we have to hear about this jerk, which honestly, good riddance. So here's where things stand today. As of this recording, Dia's ranch is currently listed for sale. Once the family finds a buyer, they're going to use the cash from that sale for a reward fund. Again, they want tips on where her body is and who may have killed her if she is no longer alive. Her family, friends, and the authorities have all come to terms with the fact that Dia is probably not alive and hasn't been for years. She's presumed dead, but hasn't legally been declared dead. As unfortunate as the truth is, they just want to find her body and put whoever killed her behind bars if that is unfortunately the case. So, it must have felt oddly relieving in December of 2023 when cadaver dogs picked up on a hit at Dia's ranch property. Now, for context, these dogs weren't working with the police. They were part of a pretty controversial group called, quote, Find Me, which hires psychics to help with missing persons cases. And they were there at Keith's request. Which I have to say is pretty odd, because if he is involved in this somehow, to then source cadaver dogs, I don't know, that seems pretty bold to me. The psychics said that they believed Dia was dead and that her remains could have been at a nearby lake called Lake Hemet. The cadaver dogs and their handlers went to the lake and they alerted everyone that they had picked up on human remains. 3 separate dogs all showed interest in one area near a dam spillway. The bad news is it didn't prove anything. The handlers admitted that something as small as a band-aid could throw the dogs off entirely. Either way, the group Find Me told the police about what had happened, but it's unclear if the detectives ever followed up on that lead.
Yeah, as you're looking at the spillway, it would be to the right of the lake at the very end of the lake.
What does the area look like? And kind of take me through the search process and what happened.
Yeah, from the road that accesses the spillway, going to the left down towards the lake, it's just a bunch of shrubs, trees, and just an incredible amount of downfall, trees that have fallen, and then a lot of huge boulders that have either placed themselves there from coming down from the mountain. But, it's 20, 30, 40 years of debris that's just down there, and it's not really easily accessible by humans.
Now, Dia's children believe that on the day that she went missing, she was taken to another undisclosed location, killed, and dumped. They're open to the possibility that the killer could have been Keith, but they also think it could have been somebody random.
What do you think happened to your mom?
I believe she was murdered, and we need to find her for her soul to rest in peace and for the community to heal. I don't believe she's still alive, personally. My mother was a lively, vivacious, gregarious individual, and she would not be able to just intentionally disappear and go somewhere. So I believe she's deceased, and something needs to be done to find her. Thus far, We haven't. And the individuals I believe to be responsible have not even been brought in for questioning. I don't know if that's...
Well, who do you think's responsible?
I really don't want to name names, you know.
Her sister Peggy also agrees that Dia is probably not alive, and she doesn't believe that Clinton had anything to do with her disappearance.
And my brother and Clinton has also done so much to try to find his mother. It's beyond. It's just beyond. He loves his mother so much that, I mean, it's made him a little beyond crazy. This poor boy is brokenhearted. He's brokenhearted.
I assume you agree that she's deceased.
I do, because my sister loved her animals. She loved the things that were in her home. Even though I had never been to that house, I know her house in La Jolla. She loved her stuff. She loved her stuff when we were growing up. I mean, she loved her dolls. If I took one of her dolls, she'd get mad at me. I know how she was. She never would have left. I think that, you know, whoever's up in that house had something to do with my sister's demise.
As for Keith, he said that Dia either left on her own or she was killed by somebody that Clinton hired. Either way, he's sticking with the idea that he had nothing to do with it and that her kids were most likely the cause of her disappearance. He even went so far as to imply that law enforcement had been, quote, paid off by Clinton.
Would it be fair to say, Mr. Harper, that you are disappointed with the efforts made by the authorities?
Without a question. I think they've been paid off, to be honest with you.
Who do you think's paid them off?
What's that?
Who do you think's paid them off?
I think Clinton paid them off.
And do you have any...
I don't have any proof of that, but I think it'll come out in time.
There's just something about this case that makes me feel like it won't stay unsolved forever, even if Dia's body is never found. There's somebody out there that knows more than they're letting on. So guys, please keep your eyes peeled for Dia. Dia is 5'5", 130 pounds, and has blue eyes and blonde hair. She was last seen wearing jeans and a red t-shirt, and she has a scar on her lower back, and it runs from hip to hip. And there's another scar on her abdomen. Anybody who might have any information about Dia or her disappearance is strongly encouraged to contact the Riverside Sheriff's County Police Department. So please share this video, share Dia's description, and hopefully her family will get some answers and will know who really is responsible here. What happened? Where did Dia disappear to? Is Keith responsible? Is her son responsible? What's the truth here? Are we going to be facing another Crystal Rogers situation? Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Thanks again for tuning in to another episode of 10 to Life. If you appreciate the case coverage, please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up on your way out and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so that you don't miss future videos. All right, guys, thanks again, and until the next one, stay safe. Bye.